morning.
Good morning.
So we're getting settled in here. So I'm going to introduce James for us this morning. So I met James in Amherst last year. I went up to Amherst with Aviva to show Rosenwald at the Yiddish Book Center. And James and his wife Lisa were kind enough to host us for dinner, Aviva and myself that night. So that was when I got to know James a little bit. And shout out for Lisa. Lisa's a filmmaker also. Her most recent film is called G.I. Jews. So maybe some of you saw it. It was at the Jewish Film Festival this past year, and Lisa's done many films besides that one. So let me put this down for a second and get my notes about James. Okay. So James is the Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of English and Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at UMass Amherst. And he has taught there since 1988. And he's the founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass. He's also taught at numerous other universities along the way. His graduate degree is from Berkeley, from way back when. As I recall, you were originally from the Bay Area. And James has written many books, starting in 1988 and up till most recently. In 1997, he was appointed by the Berlin Senate to the 5-member commission for Germany's National Memorial to Europe's Murdered Jews, which selected the design in May of 2005. He was also on the commission for the jury for the National 9/11 Memorial, which opened in September 11, 2011. He's written widely. He's gotten many awards and fellowships along the way. And last but not least, he's a baseball fan, so we're very happy. So he's not going to be, I'm sure he's happy about the Red Sox winning last year, is my guess. He's not going to tell us whether we, the Nationals, are better off or worse off without Price, but we won't rely on him for that. So with that said, I'll turn it over to James.
Thank you, Ira. Well, thanks so much. We can talk about the Nats after in the Q&A. So as Ira mentioned, I was on the jury that chose the Michael Arad design for the National 9/11 Memorial at Ground Zero in New York City. And was appointed to that jury mostly because I had somehow navigated the political shoals and aesthetic shoals of the memorial design competition in Berlin for Berlin State Ball, which we actually chose in '98, which was finally completed in 2005, dedicated in 2005, but designed by Peter Eisenman. Well, in January 2004, after reviewing 5,201 designs submitted from 63 countries around the world, we selected the Michael Arad and Peter Walker design, reflecting absence. Maybe you've seen it if you visited New York City. 2 gigantic pools in the footprints of the former towers, each with a void at the center, waterfalls coming down the edges, groves of white oaks planted in the plaza. The taller the trees grow, of course, the deeper the volumes of the voids become. We loved the way that this memorial actually reflected both absence and regenerating life in the trees. I wrote the rationale for it, and Vartan Gregorian, who was on our jury, along with Maya Lin and others, Vartan read our rationale to about 500 people at Federal Hall, downtown New York. And we weren't allowed to answer questions or talk to the press for the full year that we were deliberating these designs. So the first question I had, once we made the announcements, was from an intrepid reporter who had done his homework and said, well, let's see, so you've written at length about Daniel Libeskind and worked with him on the Jewish Museum design in Berlin. You were the Sprecher, or the spokesperson for the jury in Berlin that chose the Eisenman design. And you've written at length about counter-monuments, and negative form monuments. basically, isn't the design you've chosen here for Ground Zero just another Holocaust memorial? And I was a little bit offended, but it was a fair question. These two gigantic voids in the footprints. And I began to formulate my answer, and as I began to think about my answer and kind of got beyond being slightly offended, I realized that he did have a point. That, in fact, it's possible that all architectural aesthetics, literature, poetry, music, art, all of these media have been affected by the Holocaust. There's a preoccupation among these artists and architects and poets and composers with the great void left behind, the great irredeemable loss during the Holocaust that can never be redeemed or really domesticated by beauty. And that's become kind of a driving preoccupation. So my short answer was that there was a way in which all of art and architecture, yes, has been inflected by the Holocaust, but that doesn't make every design afterwards, and in light of the various Holocaust memorials, which I'll kind of run through here, doesn't make every single memorial a Holocaust memorial. And what kind of got me thinking was that, Maya Lin was on our jury. I've known her since 1987. She proposed, of course, and won the design competition for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And she told me early on, in '88, after dinner, after a presentation that we had given together at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, where she presented her work and her drawings for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I talked about Holocaust memorials. And she said, I have to, admit that my design owes a great debt to two other great memorials. The memorial by Edwin Lutyens, Battle of the Somme, the missing of the Battle of the Somme in France. And the other is in France also, the memorial to the déportés, the deported Jews, Paris here on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. And during her junior year abroad at Yale, as an architecture student, she talked of coming here and sitting in this space. And what she found here, what she was so inspired by, that instead of a big monument that you came up to and rose up and kind of had to push up against, she had to descend down these very narrow stairs into this space that was carved out of the ground, carved out of the landscape. This space basically opened a space in the landscape, which opened a space within her, she thought, for memory, which is really nice. And hence, the very first negative form memorial, maybe the very first so-called counter-monument, a memorial which kind of challenges the traditional idea of the monument, these big, gigantic, positive forms. This design by Henri Pinguichon was early. He proposed it, I think, as early as 1957. It was dedicated in 1962. And what he's done, which is so nice, he's taken, obviously, these triangular forms, very sharp, painful forms, and he's built this little grill of a window. So when you're in the space, you can look out and see the River Seine. And if you're standing across the river, looking at this memorial, basically what you see is kind of this elbow, the prow of a ship. But we, standing in here, are standing within this kind of triangular space, underground, carved out. Maya Lin returned home and enrolled in a monuments class. And the whole class was assigned to enter the competition for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. She drew this. This was her submission. It's a beautiful, pastel. And what she wrote in her little accompanying description is just beautiful and fascinating. She said, I wanted to take a knife and cut it into the earth and open a wound that would never be mended. And of course, in 1981, the Vietnam War was an open wound, and it wasn't going to be mended. The reception the vets had when they came home was horrible, as you remember. And she wanted to take that wound, open it up, and then polish the edges. And what she did, in effect, was also in this kind of this mall with all the great soaring white monolithic neoclassic monuments, she created this black gash, which it was called kind of pejoratively at the time. But instead of taking the very traditional, most aggressive military architectural form, which is the point of the spear, the point of the arrow, this jutting elbow, the flying wedge, she took this flying wedge and then opened it up. So this is what we come into. Not this aggressive form, the most aggressive architectural form there is, but the open arm, the embrace. Of course, this was one of about 1,000 submissions, anonymous submissions. It was a blind competition. By the end, the jury agreed unanimously that this would be their choice when they really began to understand how it was going to work. And here it is. You know, one wall extends, one axis extends to the Washington Monument, the other one extends to the Lincoln Memorial. There are no figures here. No human figures except for the reflections of those who come looking for it, who find themselves, so that instead of gigantic monumental figures, they're just humanly proportioned figures, our own reflections. And you know how people live in this space when you visit it. You see the things that they leave there. The names are arranged not alphabetically like a telephone book, but they're arranged chronologically in the order in which they fell. Soldiers fell, so that it would re-embed these fallen soldiers in history and not create a tableau of 85 Johnny Joneses. We don't know which Johnny Jones is ours, but you do if you know the order in which they fell. So from the beginning of the V, if you go right to the seam of the V and move outward, that's the order in which they fell. It looks more precarious. So this design, dedicated in 1982, had a huge kind of impact on me, and the competition itself did. I was finishing my dissertation, actually living in Israel, where I wrote my dissertation for 3 years. And I discovered that this design also had a huge effect on a generation of post-war German artists and architects who had maybe the most difficult of all Holocaust memorial conundrums. You know, how to reunite a divided Germany on the bedrock memory of a national crime. How to remember a people, the Jews murdered in the national name, and how to do this and integrate it into kind of a national memorial legacy. Nobody had ever done that before. And there was kind of a memorial paralysis for a long time in Germany after the war, because they just couldn't figure out how to do it. You know, how to do this without mending the memory of a people murdered in your name. So among the submissions for a 1995 international competition for Germany's Denkmal, National Memorial to Europe's Murdered Jews, was this proposal by Horst Hoheisel. And he meant this actually to challenge the very idea of the competition. He proposed taking the Brandenburger Tor, Germany's national monument, and blowing it up, and then covering over that whole space with granite plates. How better to remember a destroyed people, destroyed by the Nazis, than by destroying the German national monument, was his notion. He also knew that the Germans would never accept this, and that was part of the point, that he wasn't sure there should be a single national monument to Europe's murdered Jews, that it was kind of wrong-headed. It was somehow centralized and answer this question, which he felt couldn't be answered. This was a national memorial conundrum. So, in fact, it wasn't built, and in fact, the winning design for that 1995 competition was never built. Helmut Kohl ended up throwing it over and beginning over again, asking me and 4 others, all German museum directors, to form a Findungskommission to find Germany's national memorial design. They did this when, after this competition failed, the winning design was just horrible. Everybody knew it. Kohl voided the whole competition. And then they had a series of symposia. I came to give a keynote at the very last one. There must have been 1,800 people or so there. And I basically just told the stories of other national memorial processes in the States, in Israel, Poland, Hungary, Holland, just to put it into context that every nation, in fact, has this memorial conundrums, Holocaust memorial conundrums, and these Holocaust memorials will, in fact, reflect the preoccupations, both aesthetic and political, of all these countries. Israel, had a huge battle around, what day to call Yom HaShoah, Nisan 27. Yad Vashem, what part of the national fabric and landscape, will Yad Vashem, be placed in, and how will it reflect Israel's national heritage and history? Remember, nearly half of Israelis in 1948, when the state was declared, were either refugees or survivors from the Holocaust. So, in 1986, Jochen Gertz and his then wife Esther Shalev-Gerz won a competition in Hamburg for a memorial to peace and against violence and fascism, a generic Holocaust memorial. And both of them were very suspicious of the idea of the monument. In fact, Esther, who was Israeli, when Jochen proposed that they do this together, she said, we already have enough monuments. Why don't we make one that disappears, that goes away? So they proposed this 12-meter tall lead column and invited visitors to add their names to ours. And in so doing, we commit ourselves to remain vigilant. In the end, it's my favorite line, in the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. Basically, when this memorial disappears, only the people who came looking for memory will now look within themselves. And they also wanted to call the memorial bluff. That is, this idea that we make memorials to stand up against injustice struck them as absolutely offensive. Because we stand up against injustice. Our memorials don't do it for us. These memorials need to return the burden of memory to us. And so sure enough, people came out and they wrote their names in nice, neat little rows. But before long, it became kind of a trap for graffiti and swastikas, and people would stab it with ice picks and try to pull the lead off and paint on it. And the town, the city of Hamburg, this is located in Harburg, a little suburb across the river, finally said, this is horrible. We could have paved 8 kilometers of Autobahn with the money we spent on this, this monstrosity. And the artist simply replied, just keep adding your names and it will begin to disappear. So between 1986 and 1993, in fact, after 12 sinkings, it did disappear, covered with names all the way down. Jochen Gertz proposed later on that with the rise of xenophobia and anti-Semitism in Germany, maybe it should start coming back up like a barometer to measure the temperature.
How does it go down?
It's there's a big set screw underground.
Wheel it down.
Yeah, and then a crane comes in and hooks the top. They loosen the set screw and it goes down 1.5 meters, and then they crank the set screw, and the crane goes away. And it was kind of a big deal. The TV cameras came, the news crews came out, and you had to watch this every time. So that became part of the performance. And it was meant to be very much of a performance, but also to challenge all the conventional memorial kind of vernaculars, the way that Maya Lin did. It was very much meant to be a counterpoint to longevity, to permanence, to its, it wanted to counterpoint the traditional sacrosanctness of memorials that, ask you not to violate them. It invited, violation in this way, and would eventually go away and leave that space, that open space for memory, thereby, like Maya Lin, carving a space in the landscape meant to carve out a space within us. And this was a recurring theme. Jochen and Esther were very much influenced by Maya Lin, as was Horst Hoheisel. So here's the empty space. That's what you have now. Jochen Gerz, in 1991, went to teach at the Institute of Fine Arts in Saarbrücken. Their classes were actually held right here at the Saarbrücker Schloss, which had been the Gestapo headquarters during World War II. He invited half the class to go out and steal cobblestones from the rest of the city, and then to pull cobblestones out of this big plaza here, and then take them up to the classroom where the other half of the class is researching the names of every single destroyed Jewish cemetery in Germany during the war, between 33 and 45. Some 2,162 destroyed Jewish cemeteries. They carved the names of each of these cemeteries on a cobblestone and then returned them under the cover of night to the plaza. But of course, this being Jochen Gerz's project, they returned these cobblestones inscribed side down. So there's no visible record of it. And when everybody came down to find the memorial, of course, the students, probably a little bit too complacently, asked people to look within themselves for the memory they searched for here. Yeah. And again, the process in the education process was more important than the result. And this is a lesson that when I keep getting invited actually to work with the governments, whether Berlin or 9/11 Commission or in Norway, I've been back and forth 20 times a year working with them on their National July 22 process. And they ask me often, like, they pick me up, take me right to the government offices, and they say, okay, tell us what to do. So I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to keep you company as we figure it out. Don't worry about what it's going to be. Worry about respecting our process. We're going to work through, and we'll get there. But don't foreclose the process, which is more important. And that's what these artists really have taught us.
What is the July 22 website?
You remember in July 22, 2011, the Andrei Breivik murdered 69 kids on this island and blew up the government center. So they're still doing it. So Horst Hoheisel, who in '95 had proposed blowing up the Brandenburger Tor, in 1986, right when Jochen and Esther were designing their sinking monument, he proposed this counter monument to remember the Aschrotbrunnen, or the Aschrot Fountain, in Kassel, Germany. Kassel is where the Documenta, art fair happens, but every 5 years. He proposed taking the original form of this fountain, which had been donated to the town and city of Kassel by a local Jewish philanthropist in 1911, taking the form, but it was destroyed by Nazis in 1938 as the Jews' fountain. They wanted to destroy every sign of any Jewish gift to the city. And so instead of rebuilding the fountain, he took the original form and built it into the ground so that you would have no standing form except for the people who come looking. Now remember, he's not coordinating this with the Gerzes, but this is the mindset. This is what they kind of learn from Maya Lin. And that these become places for people to visit. It becomes about the visitors and the memory in the visitors' minds. And he literally said, when he proposed this, that rather than creating a monument, I want to create a pedestal on which the people coming to look for memory will stand. And that's what he did. So the only vertical form here would be the people looking for memory. Misha Ullman, an Israeli artist who was living part-time in Germany, won the competition for the book burning memorial on the Babelplatz in Berlin. And once again, his vernacular was very much carving ditches in the ground. He was kind of a landscape artist in this way. Had been in several exhibitions actually with Esther Shalev. one I saw in Jerusalem in 1981, in fact. So he won this competition by proposing not a big statue of flames, or books burning, of course, but by creating 3 spaces, 2 steel tablets with a window in the very middle. One steel tablet described the book burnings of March 1933. The other one was just a simple quote from Heinrich Heine, where books are burned, so one day too will people be burned as well. And the window that people come stand over and look down into simply looks into a room of empty bookshelves. The books cannot be replaced, the authors cannot be replaced, they're gone forever. Absence will now be remembered by absence. The void of lost life will be remembered by a void. And this preoccupation with voids, think of Daniel Libeskind's design for the Jewish Museum, based on 6 voids built into the museum, disrupting the narrative flow. It's an absolute preoccupation by this whole generation. And we find it in art, all kinds of art and literature too. But what happens when architects begin making this idea of the void the bearing wall of their designs? And this is in effect what this generation has been doing. This preoccupation with absence informed Rachel Whiteread's winning memorial design for Vienna's memorial at the Judenplatz to Austria's murdered Jews. She also took a bookish theme. The people of the book would now be remembered by what she calls the Bibliothek. This, basically, she talks about materiality as an index of absence. Her previous work included a piece called Row House, in which she filled the inside of a row house in London with concrete, filling all the empty spaces with concrete, and then pulling the walls and the roof and everything away, so that you have basically a standing sculpture of empty space. That in the house, the walls and everything are gone, and you have now just the space. She did spaces underneath chairs, bathtubs. Yeah, she was really interested in what she called materiality as an index of absence.
There's a great show at the National Gallery.
Oh, yeah.
Now.
Oh, is it right now?
Yes, right now. All of the stuff is represented.
Okay, maybe I'll have to go straight there.
Highly recommend it.
Okay, I'll go straight there. So she won. So this design is meant to materialize the space between the leaves of a book in the library and the walls. So it's like taking the space and turning the library inside out. Not the books themselves, but just that little space, those couple inches, between the books and the walls. And she placed it right here at the Judenplatz. Judenplatz is so named because of a pogrom in the 15th century of all of the area's Jews who were herded into their synagogue and burned alive in their synagogue, right on this site in the 15th century. Some people said, well, maybe that should be the memorial, because when they began excavating, they found the ruins of this auto de fe. And she said, well, I don't think you really want to do that, because in fact, if you go around the corner to the church, there's a tapestry which tells the story of that pogrom. And it says, on this site, in 1523, the Hebrew dogs were punished for their terrible crimes. That's how the pogrom was remembered, inculpating the victims. So they agreed that they should go forward, and they did. It was very controversial for a while, but now it stands and is widely visited. But once again, this preoccupation with absence, or the void, is right at the center of this. Shimon Ati, the American artist, moved to Berlin in 1990, just after the wall came down, and was struck by what he didn't see, which was any sign of Jews in near the Alexanderplatz here, right in the Mitte, in the Scheunenviertel district in the middle of Berlin. So he went and researched and found hundreds of photographs of what they were then calling displaced Jews or paperless Jews from mostly Ostjuden from the East, who were living and working and had their bookshops here. He took photographs that were taken at the time, this one from like 1926, and projected the photo right onto the very same doorway that the photo was originally taken, to reanimate the cityscape with the memory of the Jews who once lived here. This is a Jewish bookstore, Hebrew bookstore, right on the very same thing. And, I mean, the effect is beautiful. I mean, uncanny. There's a palimpsest. It's almost like if you pull away, if you scratch off the surface, you're going to get down to this somehow. And he would leave the showing all night. And then in another part of the city, he would do the same thing for several nights in a row. He did this in some 35 different sites. And again, the performance was really important, but most, for him, he wanted to remind everybody that by themselves, buildings or monuments never remember anything, that they depend completely on what we project onto them. And here he would project onto them the images of the Jews who once lived in this neighborhood. So, in 1997, I was appointed to this Findungskommission. We were allowed to invite 25 artists, including we invited Rachel Whiteread, among others, Daniel Libeskind, Peter Eisenman, Jochen Gertz also. And we got down to 3 finalists. This one by Libeskind, again, kind of a gapped wall or a breached wall. But in this space and in the model, you can see that he allows the Memorial Plaza to run across the street and point right at the Goethe bus in the Tiergarten right across the street. You can see the Brandenburger Tor, and you can see the Reichstag, and this photo would almost be like it was taken from Potsdamer Platz. But we didn't like the idea of Libeskind becoming, kind of the sole architect, for all of Germany's Jewish memorials. And this was very much a German memorial. It wasn't meant to be a Jewish memorial. It was meant to be a memorial to Europe's murdered Jews for Germany. The Jewish community in Germany really wanted almost nothing to do with this process. This was our favorite. This actually got 3 first-place votes on our 5-member commission by Gesine Weinmiller, a young German architect. And you can see, if you want, a little bit of the Vietnam veterans design here. It's built into the ground. It's meant to be carved out. The only positive forms here are big sandstone, limestone blocks, a little bit like what you would find in the Kotel, in the western wall. 18 of them, 18 segments, of course, for Hebrew gematria, for Chai, and arranged randomly, so everybody would have to find their own way in and among these segments. But of course, as we realized, walking along the parapet, getting to that right-hand corner, these randomly arranged segments began to compose themselves into a Jewish star. And then as we walked away, the star kind of decomposed and fell apart. We liked that, but we worried it might be a little bit gimmicky also. The Germans end up not trusting, I think they're one of the great young architects, just as they couldn't trust themselves completely and appointed me, an American Jew, to be their Sprecher on this commission. I think they couldn't really trust the German architects as well. And so they wanted, we end up with 2 final designs. This one by Peter Eisenman and Richard Serra, and the one by Gesine Weinmiller. They gave public talks, public opinion began to swirl, and finally came down hard on the side of this. And we did like this design, but in its original iteration, it was 4,200 stele, ranging from ground level all the way to almost 28 feet tall. We could picture kids running out over the tops of these and falling and breaking their necks. And so we talked to Sarah and Eisenman, and we said, look, we like the idea that you've created kind of a threatening, ominous, even dangerous memorial, but we don't like literally dangerous memorials. We like figuratively dangerous memorials. We think Germans should be threatened when they enter the space. but it shouldn't be a memorial where they actually can never get out, or a memorial that they've got necks running out over the top. So we asked you to scale it down. And it was also kind of on the bombastic side. And Sarah said simply, well, if you do that, it's not really my memorial anymore, because in fact, my big Cort 10 ellipses do occasionally fall over and kill workmen putting them on. And we said, well, that's great, but not for the dead bomb. You can't actually kill anybody. So Eisenman happily scaled it down. Here was the space, the empty space, which of course lots of people proposed just leaving empty. 20,000 square meters, almost 5 acres. Here was the space before the wall came down. It was really regarded as kind of a no man's land. The wall cut right through it, barbed wire. Several East Germans did die trying to scale the wall right here, right next to the Brandenburger Tor. Hitler's bunker is right at the very tip top of the East German flag, the DDR flag. You can see there. There's like a little teeny parking lot. Nothing ever marked it. It is now marked, but it was never marked all those years. So the site itself is central, right in the middle of Berlin. It was the site that Kohl picked as soon as the wall came down. This became his favorite place, because he didn't know what else to put here. And so Eisenman scaled it down without telling Sarah, and then presented the design to our committee and to the Chancellor's office with Sarah there. And Sarah said, well, if this is the design, then it's not me. These are too small, there's not threatening enough, et cetera, et cetera. But for us, it was an improvement. So Sarah left the process, and Eisenman was glad to take it over. It's his own. So technically, he's the sole author of this design. It's kind of a waving field. It's meant to be animate. It's meant to reflect on the one hand, maybe cemetery stones, but in the other, instead of nice, neat cemeteries, it would be a little more like one of the Eastern European Jewish cemeteries. Think a little bit about Łódź or Prague. Every stele is 3 degrees off plumb. Gives you this waving sense. And of course, the topography is this waving sense. Everybody would find their own way in, and we hope their own way out. Under construction here, you can see there's something completely abstract about it. And it did raise the question, is there something logically that connects this design to the mass murder of Europe's Jews? And it's so abstract that other than possibly resembling or echoing a cemetery, there's nothing concrete. And so this became a political football during the 1998 elections. And we finally proposed to Parliament in the end that you need to vote on this in 3 parts. First, do you want a central Denkmal to Europe's murdered Jews in Berlin on this site? And if yes, do you want the Eisenman, what we were calling Eisenman 2 design, the second Eisenman design? And if yes, do you build, as we think you should, a place of information underneath it? The place of information underneath it is finally what holds this abstract design up and holds it aloft. And they agreed on all 3 of those things. It passed after kind of tumultuous meetings in the Parliament. And construction began after the election, when the Social Democrats couldn't put together a coalition without the Green Party, and so asked Joschka Fischer to join the governing coalition. And Joschka Fischer agreed only on the condition that this memorial be built. It had been opposed by Schroeder and Naumann, his culture minister, and now they had to go ahead and build it, and they did. Joschka Fischer insisted that this go forward, and then he based a decision he made in 1999 when Germany joined NATO's Air Force and used the German Air Force for the very first time to bomb another soil, which NATO did, you'll recall, during the coalition to stop the Serbs from a certain extermination of the Kosovar Albanians. And he said, it's not enough for Germany to have a national Holocaust memorial, or Denkmal, if we don't act on it. Yeah. This memorial extends to action. And so he actually abrogated Germany's constitution. He made an exception that we will leave German soil this time and this time only to stop a certain genocide. So that became very much a part of Germany's fabric. And what I especially like about this design with the place of information underneath, it's probably my favorite, if you can have a favorite, Holocaust Memorial exhibition. It's very, very simple. It's very accurate. It's very moving. It's 4 rooms built underneath here. And Dagmar von Wilken designed these rooms so that the displays are on what seem to be the sunken roots of the Stele. So you've got this illusion of the Stele coming down into the space, helping to define the space below, and then you've got the sense of the abstract space above being anchored in very hard history below. Yes?
I think you mentioned that we're 4,280 or some odd.
Yeah, it got shrunk down
Is
to
that-
2,711.
Those are not magic numbers that mean something, or do they?
They didn't for Eisenman, but of course somebody pointed out that there are 2,711 chapters in the Talmud. So you'll always find, I mean, if you look hard enough, you'll always find something. So he was pleased with that, for what it's worth.
Where is this?
Right in the center of Berlin. Yeah. So, we're thinking, I mean, remember, all of this is on my mind too when I'm trying to answer this question. Haven't you created another Holocaust monument in New York City? Because I'm on the advisory committee also for the museum. The museum in New York, of course, is built below the memorial. So you've got the abstract design above, these 2 gigantic squares and voids, anchored in the history of that day, below. This kind of this yin and yang of history and memory being anchored in hard history below. And with abstract designs, I think that's how you make abstraction work. And that's the answer to, I mean, so what makes this a Holocaust memorial? What makes this a 9/11 memorial? It's anchored in the story itself, in the historical narrative. And the kids do run out over the tops. So I'm going to fast forward. So while the Denkmal is being built, my book at Memory's Edge came out telling the story of the Denkmal and how it came into being in my role in the jury. On September 11, 2001, we had the attacks, and within about 2 weeks, I began getting calls from the mayor's office and the governor's office to work with them on how to commemorate 9/11. Way, way too early. And my answer was, I did meet with them. They had, for some reason, they kept asking Paul Goldenberg and me to come and meet with them.
Paul Goldberger?
Called Paul
Goldberger.
Goldenberg. And we basically had the same thing to say, that this isn't memory yet. This is unfolding history, and we don't know what it means. The only people who have a grasp of the meaning of 9/11 are the families who lost loved ones. I said, maybe you need to rethink your idea of a memorial as a finished object, and think about your memorial in what I called stages, the stages of memory. Beginning with the attack itself, reflected in the people's eyes and faces as they witnessed the attack, as it was related by people watching it unfold. And I reminded them, I said that, it's estimated that some 1.6 billion people around the world saw the towers come down on live TV.
Oh.
Turning 1.6 billion people around the world into witnesses, eyewitnesses, to whom it seemed to happen. It happened to them, too, in this weird way. Why it was just so shocking. So why don't you think of the memorial as having already been initiated by people at the candlelight vigils that very night here at Union Square, Washington Square in New York, and on the promenade in Brooklyn Heights. These were spontaneous. Nobody told these people they had to remember or how to remember. They already had ways to remember. Very traditional candlelights. Light keeping away the darkness. The flickering light, kind of reflecting the fragility and the reality of life itself. The comfort that the warmth might bring you in this cold moment. Nobody ordered families to put up these flyers, but think of this too as part of your memorial. The thousands and thousands of flyers which appeared overnight, put up by families whose loved ones didn't come home that day. Never came home, and 1/3 of whose remains were never found. Completely incinerated when the towers came down. Now, something interesting with these flyers, the flyers I find especially moving, but also because they seem a little bit like very ephemeral tombstone epitaphs. Missing. Have you seen my mother? Have you seen my father? Have you seen our son? And then married to so-and-so with these children. So it's very much almost like a very traditional Jewish headstone in which all this family information comes up. But this motif, this missing motif, these are people who never came home. These are absences are now being remembered as absence. So nobody told Michael Arad to make a memorial called Reflecting Absence, but this motif was in his brain, and was apparently in his brain from a very early part of the process, which I'll get to. For most New Yorkers who didn't know anybody, of course, the absence was the absence of the towers themselves. There was a conflation in the minds, I think, of most New Yorkers of absent people and absent buildings. The firefighters, of course, knew exactly whom they lost, what they lost, and presented an issue for us on the jury. Are firefighters to remember differently or privileged in some way for having died civic deaths and not just deaths, being in office buildings and going to work? These firefighters who actually, many of them coming within 2 or 3 miles of the towers and then hiking the rest of the way, with 100 pounds of equipment on their backs. And we ended up resolving that in a way that I'll explain. At first, many people said, let's just leave the ruins smoldering as a memorial. So, no, this would be the way that the killers, the bombers, would have remembered their victims. This would be basically their triumphal monument. Allowing all these people's destruction and the tower's destruction to come be, the motif. What about the lives lived? Remember people for how they lived, not for how they died. But we've been working through a lot of that. Even at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. These meetings where I have meetings tomorrow. I'm on the committee. This was always a part of, kind of how far we've come, since the late 40s and early 50s, and how to remember victims of mass murder. But I said these two are stages. So you've got great photographers taking photographs here. How about just remember this facade? How about leaving the facade up as a memorial? So, that too will be remembered as part of the process. The firefighter said, look at this. This is a natural memorial. If you're an Irish Catholic firefighter, of course, it's perfect. Well, this has been reserved as it is, and it's going to be moved back to the perimeter of Ground Zero within the next year. Michael Arad's not happy about that. He wants his design to be the memorial, but these sites will evolve over time. And he's learned. On the 6-month anniversary, you have what was called, first called Towers of Light, which upset the families and said, so what are you remembering the towers? What about the people? Of course. So they changed the name from Towers of Light to Tribute in Light, to those who lost. Tribute in Light was a design by this team of light artists. Originally meant to be the birthday candles for the 30th anniversary of the World Trade Center's construction. So they had this design before the destruction, and they use this now as memorial candles. And beautiful, and we actually made as part of our decision in the end, we mandated that this be shown every year on 9/11. So they now have an endowed fund and a place where these will beam every single year. The first anniversary, it was done very simply. The mayor's office, Mayor Bloomberg's office, organized a recitation of names, kind of a Jewish tradition, almost like the Yizkor tradition. The names were recited, and with every name recited, family members would take a flower, a rose, down into the pit, now completely cleaned up, all the way down to bedrock, and put it in one of these two reflecting pools. So early on, nobody has designed anything, but in creating a process, in creating a space for people to come remember on the anniversaries, this was a natural space because it was now empty, an empty space that people now filled with their memories of their loved ones. And this was the commemoration they had every year for 9 years. They asked, what should come first, the buildings or the memorial? The rebuilding or the memorial? And of course, there's no right answer. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. It doesn't matter. They could have parallel processes. No matter what comes first, the other will follow. So they went with rebuilding, and of course in rebuilding, the two finalist teams for the new World Trade Center design, the Think team here, and then Libeskind, you'll see in a sec, built into their designs memorial aspects. They couldn't just build buildings, but they also built these memorials. So this was the Think team, Frederick Schwartz and Raphael Vignoli's design. The families hated it because they said it reminded them of death. Two skeletal forms, offices going up maybe halfway, where they'd be safe. So it was really kind of both a skeletal monument, but also a defensive one, not letting people go all the way up again. And included in this design was a definition, an articulation of the footprints, these empty cubes. So already this preoccupation with missing and absence of the empty cube is part of the Think team's design, which I liked a lot. I also liked that design okay. But the families hated it, and so Governor George Pataki made an executive decision to choose summarily the Libeskind design. This is the original proposal by Libeskind, what he called vertical gardens, where he's planting hanging gardens in this asymmetrical spire on top of the new World Trade Center, which would be 1,976 feet high. I'm sorry, 1,776 feet high as a kind of commemoration of the American independence. It was meant to echo in this asymmetry the Statue of Liberty torch. A little prosaic, a lot of people thought, but Pataki liked it and the families liked it. So Pataki just chose this design, and there was no more vote. LMDC didn't like it, but he's said somebody's got to step in and protect the families. So the Libeskind design, Daniel Libeskind, who moved back from Berlin to New York City just to do this, returned. Libeskind built into his design this big empty space, the footprints articulated, as you see by sod here, but also created a little bit of a problem for memorial artists, later on. So this design was chosen and announced in February 2003. In March, I got a call to join a jury from the mayor's office for a memorial competition. Anita Contini called me. And we began a process knowing that whatever we chose was going to have to somehow fit within this. And so the architects on our jury, which included Maya Lin and Michael van Valkenburg, Michael van Valkenburg is a great landscape architect who was actually the chair of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Committee that chose Maya Lin's design. It all comes around. There's that arc, yeah. And so when we sat down, the first thing they did was to take Libeskind's model here, and Michael van Valkenburg walked over and lifted this cantilevered culture center right off the model and put it in the closet and closed the door. He said, it's overdetermined. There's too much here. And our job is to leave the footprints unencumbered. That's part of our memorial mandate. We announced the memorial competition in April 2003. We were here, the jury. Paula Grant Berry, the sole family member on the jury, began by announcing what we were doing. Maya and I then talked about the memorial aspects and the memorial mandate we had. And by August 1st, we had received, actually by July 1st, we had received 13,800 registrations from 80 countries. And you will remember that the nationals from 82 countries died on 9/11. It wasn't just an American thing. 1/3 of the victims of 9/11 were from other countries. And by August 1st, we had received 5,201 design boards from 62 countries. The process was long and agonizing, as you can imagine, exhausting. We looked at the boards 200 at a time, taking notes in then kind of an unannounced high-rise overlooking the ground zero. We were all allowed passion votes. Maya Lin's board, she recalled to us, was in fact chosen by one juror through the first several stages who saw something in it and kept advancing it to every stage. So we did that with this competition. We had weekly meetings with the mayor, who didn't tell us what to do, but who basically said, we're there for you to do whatever you finally find. We met weekly with the governor. In this particular meeting, Anita Contini, I think, took this photograph. She was the administrator ahead of the process. Maya and I had just asked the governor to promise us that he would not veto or overrule our final decision, even if we couldn't decide on choosing something. We had to be free to fail and not be forced into a defensive crouch for fear of failing and thereby choosing something that we could not provide a rationale for. And we had to ask him to take that leap of faith. He goes, if we're free to fail, we'll get there. But if we have to find something and we're fearing that you're going to choose something else, we'll never get there. So he agreed. And this is that moment where he's actually agreed. We were used politically, as I was in Berlin, as people are all the time. This is both a political process, an aesthetic process, a city and national rebuilding process. The funds for all this rebuilding, the then junior senator, Charles Schumer, guaranteed on September 13th, 2001. He had a previously scheduled meeting with President Bush, W., who agreed to release $20 billion in funds for New York to rebuild. His aides were aghast, but they went to the Rose Garden and he announced it, and Schumer knew that that was the moment when he had to ask, and he got it. So Mayor Bloomberg gave us Gracie Mansion in November to interview the 8 finalist teams. So these were 12 to 15-hour days at Gracie Mansion. This was an anonymous, completely blind competition, which is really important. Of course, a lot of people, a lot of the commentators and critics in the newspapers wanted this to be an elite competition. That is, they wanted us to invite, the 20 greatest architects of our era. And our simple answer was, If we had done that for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, we would have no violin. It can't be anonymous, and it must remain anonymous, and we're going to go by design only, not by qualifications, and it made all the difference. This is getting near dinner time. The mayor opened his vast wine cellar to us. Couldn't have done this without him and his wine cellar. We go till almost midnight every night, and we did end up with 3 final designs. This one by a French team proposing planting over the entire 5 acres of blossoming trees. A beautiful kind of pastoral, elegiac, design here. I reminded people that even if in 100 years or 200 years you forget what exactly happened here, you will always remember that something happened here. I talked about small towns in Poland I visited, Szteplach, where after the war, the remaining Poles saw the whole kind of Jewish center of these little villages as now profaned in some way, and they stayed out and let the brush and the trees grow up. So in several little villages in Haute-Fault, the center of the village is just nothing but a big, huge bramble of trees where the Jewish houses and stores had once been. And that's how they're remembered, basically, the lost Jews of these villages. So this pastoral elegiac thing I really liked a lot. Maybe you could plant the same number of trees, as those who died. This design articulated the footprints with wildflower gardens, which we also liked a lot. Just wildflower gardens in the footprints, surrounded by these, blossoming trees. But every iteration they came back with got more and more complicated. There would be 3 levels, there would be lights coming up, there would be sunlight coming down, there'd be a little river running through underneath. But we loved these computer-generated, images of what this was going to look like year-round. So basically the cycle of life, from birth, rebirth every spring, to full blossoming, to autumn, and finally to dormant winter. But every single one of these iterations got more complicated, so we had to move on to this design by a German team called Memorial Cloud, which the design architects in the jury loved in this kind of eye-catching design and the way that it would complement Santiago Calatrava's new winged bird transit center at Fulton Street, right next to it. But a few of us distrusted its spectacle. It was so beautiful and it's so eye-absorbing, but nothing happened within us. There was no space open within us. This was only just a spectacular eye candy. And I couldn't find the memorial logic in it. Maya and I and Michael Van Valkenburg argued that as beautiful as it is, where's the memorial logic? And they said, well, it's called Memorial Cloud. Well, what would that refer to? I'm afraid it would refer to the cloud of toxic gases rising from the site for almost 2 months after the attacks. This is no way to remember the victims, as beautiful as it is. But all those questions of beauty and somehow compensating the destruction with gorgeousness, this all came up the way it has for us for Holocaust memorials from the very beginning. Tubes of light, big, like a big glass, almost like a big ice lake that people would walk on. Not very hospitable during the winter or summer, we also thought. And so we chose this design by Michael Arad and Peter Walker. Michael Arad, a young architect, recently graduated from Dartmouth and then from Georgia Tech School of Architecture with a master's, designing police stations in New York City, precinct offices, right at the bottom rung. Lived in the East Village, and from the top of his roof on 9/11 saw the towers come down from the top of his roof, and devastated, as everybody. And they proposed this reflecting absence. Now, I'm going to take you back to November So we announced Michael Rod's winning design. Daniel Libeskind immediately sketched what that design would look like with this crown of high-rises, which you can see has already been evolving. This is from April 2004. Michael Rod told us when we asked him, so tell us about the design. Where'd this come from? And he said that in November 2001, 2 months after the attacks, he sketched out a memorial. And this memorial would have been the spaces of the buildings, 1 acre square, built as voids in New York Harbor, right there at Battery Park City. He said, I don't know why, but, this negative form, it had to be a void, and the voids were going to be in the water. And so he even built a rooftop water table with these voids built into it to see how it would look. Now, how you would engineer this in the river, no idea. But this was his idea. So he had this 2 months after the attacks. We didn't announce the memorial competition until April 2003. So a year and a half before there was even a competition, Michael Rod had this vision of voids in water. This was the board he submitted to us, which did catch our eyes, and we also liked that he had an underground component, what he called the gallery, underneath where you would stand and look up through the falling water to the sky and the buildings around, which we liked a lot. But what we liked was it's a minimalist aesthetic. It was too minimalist. It reproduced the great inhospitality of the big super blocks, where you'd just be knocked over by a gust of wind in the winter and bake in the summer. No trees, no light. So Michael Van Valkenburg said, look at Michael, we do love this. Can you give us some life in the plaza? So he came back with some trees. And Michael Van Valkenburg said, more trees. Can you go find a landscape architect to team up with? And so he went out and found Peter Walker, maybe America's greatest landscape architect. And Peter Walker came back with this brilliant design. He would now populate the plaza with these trees based on what he called the abacus grid. So from east-west, you could look down the streets, like the city grid, nice, neat rows of trees. But from north-south, these trees would be arranged like an abacus randomly. So from north-south, you would look and just see random rows. Random groves, combining the city grid with nature, basically, which we loved a lot. So at that point, we knew that this would be our design. This computer-generated model is pretty close to this now. Of course, the taller the trees grow, the greater the volumes would become. We asked, naming was to be a part of this. The trees were planted in the spring in New Jersey in 2004. This is how we ended up with here. 1 year before, we're still negotiating exactly where the names have now been brought from a lower gallery up top, because now we knew we were going to be building a museum underneath this to anchor this abstract design. On the 9th anniversary, we still have the very same commemorative practice we'd had all the years before. Huge controversy about an Islamic cultural center, which the city proposed unanimously to be located just a couple blocks away. New York wanted it, Bloomberg wanted it. Eventually funding fell apart, but you remember the Florida preacher who came up and was going to burn a Quran on the site. My mother called me so upset. Said, you tell Mayor Bloomberg to arrest that man the moment he gets off the plane. I'd like to. I told Bloomberg that and said, if only I could. But he never got out of the airport, by the way. He was verbally attacked as he got off the plane from Florida on this particular morning and turned around and got back on the plane. President Obama gave the opening kind of a eulogy, if you will, simply reading a psalm. And this opened only on September 11, 2011, on the 10th anniversary, to the families. My job was to take Secretary Hillary Clinton through and explain the rationale of the design to her. That everybody was there on that day. And here, I also explained how these names were arranged. Michael Arad proposed arranging the names in what he called meaningful adjacencies. So what do you mean by this? Because we're going to ask every single family where they want their lost loved one's name to be in relation to their friends or their family members, firefighters with other firefighters, flight attendants with other flight attendants, wherever they want. So every family is going to give us 4 or 5 other names, and we will arrange every single name in that way. And he did it. He found an algorithm to do this. Maya thought it was brilliant. Of course, Maya, was one of the first to take the names out of the alphabetical order and to put them in historical order. And now, by doing this, you've also returned them to their historical lived lives. The firefighters and rescue first responders' names are marked with either a ladder company number or a precinct number. That's all. But they are marked not to create a hierarchy of victims, but to mark that they died in their civic duty. And they didn't die because they were in the wrong place in the world. And the families were finally satisfied with that. So there's that, that question, is this a Holocaust memorial or just another Holocaust memorial? The answer is clearly no, but the long version of the answer, which I do in the Stages of Memory, my latest book, and in my response to the reporter, was to suggest that there is an arc of memorial vernacular linking World War I memorials, Holocaust memorials, to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which then affected the counter monuments in Germany, which now have come back and informed the 9/11 memorial here. It's the long answer to a provocative question. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, that was great. Wonderful. So I have a very general question regarding visual history, I guess you might call it. I'm not a historian of visual artifacts or the creation of them. But as you're telling the story, and as your architects are presenting competition pieces, there's a lot of narrative. It's supposed to do this, a lot of talk. It's supposed to do this, it's supposed to evoke that, it's supposed to, oughts and will they and expectations and all that. And yet it's visual. And so I don't write visual histories or architecture history. So how much when you're as judge, a critic, and you're looking at pieces that are meant to evoke memory and inform memory and teach, how much are you thinking, is that architect also someone who can tell a good story? Is it a story I can tell, but they can't? I don't know anything about Maya Lin's verbal ability, although she did beat her professor, I think, at Yale. That was a competition where she won out of it. Right. So how does that figure in your judging?
In kind of a contemporary vein, it figures a lot, quite a bit, but it always did. But traditionally, memorials were designed and chosen in ways that would bury the process.
Yes.
Because governments and leaders, very traditional, conventional memorials, and think of the most authoritarian regimes, basically want to suggest their memorials to be eternal pieces of the landscape, just kind of divinely planted. They come from nowhere but God, or that human beings didn't make them. And our generation, and even this generation of historians, is very process-oriented. Our job is to show that, in fact, history is written in real times and places by real people. It's a cultural production. Art is a cultural production with a historical context and aesthetic context. Conditioning, every piece of art. And I guess my kind of main contribution early on, my early book on memorials was called The Texture of Memory. And I saw my job is to both see what happened and how what happened gets passed down to us. That these things happened, and now it gets passed down to us via narrative, or memorials, or art, or film, photography. And I wanted to restore the genealogies of these memorial sites, because I think that we need to be instructed by as much how they came into being as what is left. That Michael Rod's design and this memorial should be seen as the tip of an iceberg held by 5,200 other designs. It took that process. And I was constantly reminding the other jurors just how important all of these, even the bad designs are. That every one of the designs represents hundreds of hours of human hours of working through their people's grief. And the way they mourn was to come up with these drawings at kitchen tables, or in great famous architects' offices, wherever. And that we have to keep all of these in mind. And that is a lot of talking, but architectural history has always been pretty talky. Libeskind, deconstructivist architects are especially talky. It's true. Eisenman and John Hayduk and the whole gang at Cooper Union. And deconstructivist architecture, is based in very complicated and pretty sophisticated, arguments, and even ideology that we cannot suggest that culture will always save us. We need to show culture as somehow broken in light of the Holocaust or in light of the war.
Thank you.
And so there is all that going on. Yes.
So I have a comment and a question. We visited the Berlin Memorial, with the big stones, and people were frolicking and picnicking, and I thought to myself, I found it I was offended, and looking at this and looking at, the Vietnam Memorial, it's like you wouldn't picture somebody doing that in these places. So I'm just wondering how that plays out in the intent, and is that
It makes a lot of people
expected?
very unhappy.
Yeah.
And we knew this was going to happen. And the German officials, parliamentarians, part of their great angst around the whole process is that no matter what they make, it's not going to be good enough. The only thing we were really good at doing is mass murder. And we're never going to be good enough ever again to remember mass murder. And so at that point it was, the enemy of perfect is the enemy of good. So nothing was going to get done. And they said, so what's going to happen when people come and they drink beer there and picnic, there, and the kids are going to play and kick, their soccer balls, through there. And I go, well, how are you going to stop them? Are you going to have guards, armed guards? Are you going to put a barbed wire fence around, keep everybody out? Are you going to arrest everybody? In other words, these sites will reflect back to the community how they remember. And there is a disconnect between the generation born after the war and the generation born during the war who bore responsibility for these, for the mass murder, and the kids, there now for whom it's only history, and history for which they're not responsible, memory for which they're responsible, but history for which they're not responsible. And so I suggested, I said, when the first swastikas begin to get painted on them, I say leave on for a week and use it as a teaching tool, bring people down and talk about the swastika, and then wash it off. And so these stelae do have embedded in their surface a solution that allows everything to be washed off. It can be cleaned. Unfortunately, they saved a little bit of money by making them the walls too thin. and so they're cracking. And when you go through, they're cracking now by the dozens, and they've created like these steel belts to hold them together. So,
Because as you said, these are meant to, reflect, like the Vietnam Memorial reflects only the people that are there. So if that's a reflection of the people that are visiting, it doesn't.
and you can point it out, and I can point it out, and they do ask for gentle reflection and comportment there. There's a little sign that says, please no bicycles, no drinking, no eating, no smoking, no.
Right.
But, the irony is not lost on memorial designers who see thereby the memorial becoming an extension of authoritarianism instead of memory of the victims of authoritarianism. So that tension's built
interesting.
in. That tension's built in,
Yeah.
and there's still people.
The Vietnam Memorial is, of course, it's really, tremendously impressive and moving and all of that. But it was very controversial at its time, as I'm sure you recall. And so I wonder if you'd comment on the three soldiers, which,
Sure.
which also is it's a nice statue, kind of looking at it. But for many people, anyway, just what do you think about the three soldiers?
I think the three soldiers kind of pale in comparison to the walls. Their story is also not a pretty story. Frederick Hart, the author, proposed this for the competition, but it wasn't chosen. But he enlisted then Ross Perot and some disgruntled veterans to go back and kind of like reopen the process, but he was pretty nasty about the whole thing. Used racially inflammatory language to describe Mai Lin. To get he wanted this to take the place of that. So it was basically a sore loser getting these things planted. I mean Mai Lin would prefer them not to be there. But if you look at them both, there is a way in which there's a little bit of a compliment if people are desperate for figuration.
Yeah.
They've got their three figures, but they're cliche figures.
Right.
The Latino, the African American, and the white guy. And I think a more interesting compliment is the Flying Wedge Korean War Memorial, just a little bit further away, because the Flying Wedge is now that the physical contents of the empty are. So I think they kind of fit together. Mai Lin's is the Flying Wedge from the inside, and the Flying Wedge soldiers, in their rain jackets, are kind of would fill that. So I like that compliment a little bit more. But you have to allow all of them to talk to each other and allow the stories of how they come into being to remain in sight.
Thank you.
If this is not too personal a question, how did you get involved in this field of study? I mean, what drew you to it? What brought you to it?
Well, I didn't volunteer for any of this to begin with. When I wrote my dissertation, I wrote most of it in Israel, but I began it at YIVO as a fellow at YIVO at the Yiddish Archive in New York City in 1979. And then I went to Israel in late 80 through 83, where I finished my dissertation writing with Sidra Ezrahi, Huda Bauer, and Saul Friedlander.
What's the dissertation about?
Called Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust. It was a dissertation on the Holocaust literature.
Oh, okay.
But looking at how every medium shapes history and narrative. So I began my study with diaries, to memoir, to chronicles, to fiction, to theater, poetry, audiovisual testimony, and memorials and museums. And the memorials and museums came up when I would come back from a summer in Poland doing research at Auschwitz in 1981, 82, and I would present what I had found there in the Sonderkommando diaries. So I was writing about narrative, but I'm sitting in a barracks, which is the library at Auschwitz, surrounded by barbed wire and the horrible things that happened in these barracks, reading these diaries, and then I realized that I can't read these in isolation. These were buried by Sonderkommando in little bottles and tin cans right next to the crematorium and gas chamber complexes. And they were dug up later, and now here they are, in this little Yiddish mouse handwriting, all folded up. And I said that I need to write about both where they come from, the context in which I'm reading them, and that allowed me to look up from the table to the spaces around me, and I began writing about that too. And my blessed mentors didn't stop me. Maybe they should have, but Friedlander in particular, and Judith Bauer and Sidra said, just keep writing. And so I wrote about the memorial sites, and I showed slides so that when I would go to a place, like Buchenwald and Dachau, I would take as many pictures, hundreds and hundreds of pictures. And then I began looking at national narratives and the spaces created for, school children's narratives to be created. And so I made that as the last part of my dissertation, and then it was the last chapter of my first book, Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust. It also stems from 1976. In October 76, I was backpacking through Europe. I spent a year and a half with a backpack, visiting all these sites, doing the initial research. And a German family who never met an American or a Jew took me in. I got lost in Lubeck. And they took me in, and I went to school with the young daughter and her boyfriend and rode the boyfriend's motorcycle around the countryside. And the father one day, when the kids had gone to school, said, I want to show you something. And he drove me out to a beach about 20 kilometers from Travemünde. It's called Timmendorfer Strand. And to a little memorial there called, it was a little memorial to the catastrophe of the SS Cap Arcona. And he just showed me. It was in a setting, and there were like these weird mounds nearby. And I read it, and this was a memorial to the Häftlinge, that is the concentration camp prisoners who had survived death marches all the way from Poland, all the way through Germany, all the way to the north, where they were loaded onto 2 luxury cruise liners and sent out into the Baltic Sea on May 4th, 1945, where they were bombed and strafed by the Royal Air Force and sunk. 8,000 survivors killed by the Royal Air Force in these 2 ships. I go, I've never heard of this. And he says, well, I was, after the war, I came back and this is where I lived, and I remember. And so I said, so what's the catastrophe? The catastrophe is that the Royal Air Force killed all these survivors from the death march. Well, where were they going? Why were they attacked? The Royal Air Force thought that they were troop transports of German troops trying to escape on the day before the war ended. And of course, the catastrophe for the local citizens was that these bodies washed ashore all summer long. And they buried them in these big mass graves where the memorial was. And this is 1976, and I gotta say, something clicked. Whoa. And what this means for you, what it means for the community, what it means for me. So this memorial becomes almost like this weird screen onto which we're all projecting our preoccupations and our worries and our fears and our memories. And so it did become so much text for me to deconstruct or to understand. So my study of literature extended into the study of spaces, in which I found this literature, and that's how I began.
Wow. Great story.
I just want to comment, thank you very much for great talking, but also comment on what Marcia said. When I went to the Shanksburg Memorial, it was made very clear that it was sacred space because the bodies could not be found. And there was no frolicking. I mean, yes, it was a cold day in January or whatever it was, but there was no frolicking, there was no picnicking, and I hear your comment about not making it a police state at the memorial, but maybe the signs are too small.
They do need to be conditioned. I think it's a big public space. The Denkmal is huge. you see some frolicking at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. You even see a little bit at the 9/11 Memorial. The family members with young children do spread picnics on 9/11.
It's
The whole
not right
memorial.
on top, it's not like
Well,
right, you know.
no, but on the benches, and they were meant for sitting under the trees.
Yeah.
And in September, of course, it's a nice time in New York. And they do spread big, like picnic blankets while the names are being read. Life goes on. So our questions, and as critics or historians, how are these lived in? And what do we think of it? And it's really okay for kids. In other words, the little, children of, relatives they never met do deserve to play and live, and the parents aren't going to stop them from frolicking. And then when after frolicking, they'll put flowers in the names of their lost loved one, and then they'll go back and have something to eat. So the way these things get lived in really do matter, and how we condition it and how we prescribe certain kinds of behavior. I mean, every culture does it a little bit differently. And I do think probably the signs at the Denkmal, there's only one marker that invites people to act respectfully here. But it's down on the ground and it's near the entry to the place of information. And hardly anybody sees it. I'd say only 10% of the visitors would even see that. And the rest just see this big sea of waving Stelle in the middle of the city.
Right.